Hi, my name is Jared Johnson. I'm a technical marketing engineer for CData Software. In today's video, we'll learn how to install and configure the API server. The API server is an installed application that allows you to build REST, OData, and JSON APIs for many different data sources, including RDBMS, NoSQL Big Data, flat files, and other sources. These APIs can be consumed from web applications, mobile applications, and custom applications. They can also be used in the BI, ETL, and reporting tools that you already use. The API server can be installed locally on Windows, Mac, and Linux Unix machines and in hosted environments like Windows Azure, Amazon EC2, and Heroku. The API server works with common web and application servers like Windows IIS and Apache Tomcat. To begin, we'll install the application. Navigate to www.cdata.com/API server. Click the download button and choose the appropriate platform. Now that we have installed the API server, we can explore the server options. To do so, find the API server icon in the system tray, right-click, and select Server Options. There are several tabs that allow us to configure the API server. The Service tab allows us to choose whether or not to run the API server as a Windows service and includes logging information about the API server. The Web Server tab allows us to configure connectivity to the API server, including the maximum number of connections and whether or not to enable plain text and TLS protocols. If you enable TLS protocols, you will need to assign a server certificate. If you browse for a certificate, you can choose a certificate from the available system stores. The Cloud Gateway tab allows you to enable the Cloud Gateway, which is a reverse SSH tunnel from an SSH server to the API server. Simply configure the host, port, username, password, and certificate for the SSH server to allow external access to the API server through SSH. The Other tab allows you to configure logging for the API server, including the depth of logging, where the logs are stored, how often to rotate log files, and how long log files are allowed to persist on disk. To exit the API server, click on Exit. Otherwise, simply close the interface and open the API server. Once you've navigated to the API server in your web browser, log in using the credentials you configured when you installed the application. You will notice that there are several pages for the API server. We'll explore each of these pages in detail as we configure the API server. The first page is the status page. On it, you'll find information about the number of connections, resources, actions, and users for the API server, along with the requests and failures. The settings page is where we'll configure connectivity to the API server, from connections to data sources and specific resources exposed by the API server, to users with different permissions to connect and work within the APIs. The Users tab allows us to create new users. First, we'll create an admin level user with full read and write permissions. You can see the auth token that will be needed to connect. Next, we'll create a user that only has permission to read data from the API server. With both users configured, we're ready to configure a connection to a data source. To configure a connection to a data source, navigate to the Connections tab and select Add Connection. By default, the API server can connect to several RDBMS, SaaS, and Big Data and NoSQL sources. For this video, we'll create a connection to a SQLite database. Select SQLite and configure the connection, creating a name for the connection and providing the SQLite file to connect to. For all connections, you can choose either to use a property list or supply a raw connection string. Once the connection is configured, click Test Connection and then Save Changes. Now that we've created a connection, it will appear in the Connections tab. From here, we can edit a connection to update credentials or other connection properties, and even delete a connection that is no longer needed. With the connections created, we're ready to add resources. Resources represent the objects exposed in your API that can be queried, created, updated, and deleted. To create a new resource, click Add Resource. Select a connection, and then choose a table exposed by the connection. From here, you can choose which columns to expose and which operations to enable for the connection. You can also rename the resource to ensure that your users know exactly which resource they're connecting to. I'll pause the recording here and add all of the resources offline. With all of the other resources added, we're ready to move on to actions. Actions typically represent stored procedures for the data source you're connecting to. In this case, there are none available. The next tab we'll explore is the Server tab. Here we can edit server-specific configurations, including trusted IP addresses. For this demo, we'll allow connectivity from any IP address using an asterisk. The Server tab also allows you to configure cross-origin resource sharing, which is needed if any client applications are hosted on a different domain from the API server. You can configure which domains to allow, which methods, and more. The last section allows you to configure the OData protocol for the API server, including how paging is handled, the default format, the default OData version, and modify the base URL used to connect to the API server. Once you've completed your configurations, click Save Changes. The Notification tab allows you to enable email notifications whenever an error occurs and enable Windows Application Event Logging. From the Settings page, we'll move to the API page. Here we see the API definitions for connecting to the API server and the exposed resources. The discovery endpoints allow you to dynamically discover the resources and their metadata. There's also a Swagger endpoint to allow connectivity from Swagger-enabled tools and services. Under Resources, you will see a list of the resources exposed, with documentation on reading from and writing to those resources. For example, we can navigate to the address for the Albums resource to retrieve a list of the albums in our SQLite database. The data is returned in unformatted JSON, which is a little difficult to read, but is easily understood by many of the tools and applications you already use to work with your data. By exploring the API, you can see how to perform create, update, and delete operations against any resources with those operations enabled. Lastly, we'll look at the Publish page, which allows you to publish your API to a different location or machine without exposing all of the administrative functionality of the API server to your users. This means you can restrict who has access to the web interface for creating connections, resources, actions, and users, and limit your client's access only to the resources and actions that you expose. Simply provide the necessary information for the file system, location, user, and log database, and click Publish. With the API server configured, you are now ready to connect. If you have any questions, navigate back to the website www.cdata.com/API server for more information. If you need further assistance, you can contact our support team by emailing support@cdata.com. Download a free trial of the API server and build instant APIs for your relational, big data, NoSQL, and SaaS sources today. Thanks for watching our video.